We can start for those who are joining us on time. So good morning and good afternoon. Welcome all to this webinar that ISD is hosting on navigating the landscape of voluntary standards and initiatives for carbon management. I am Cristina Larrea and I lead the Sustainability Standards work stream at ISD. With our work, we aim to advance sustainable and inclusive value chains through sustainability standards and related measures. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar and do some opening remarks. The climate crisis that we are living in is pushing all of us to urgently take actions to reduce carbon emissions, to maintain global warming at 1.5 degrees, and keep the planet safe and healthy for all of us. In the last 4 to 5 decades, voluntary standards and initiatives have emerged to support various actors in measuring the carbon emissions, purchasing offsets, or disclosing their strategies and results in reducing carbon emissions. Being ahead of regulations in many jurisdictions, these schemes can help private sector actors be transparent and accountable about their carbon emissions, as well as being effective in their carbon management strategies to reduce emissions and reach net zero. But which are these standards? How do they operate? How do they support companies in measuring and reducing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? What are their strengths and how they can improve to address the climate urgency? A couple of years ago, we started to work on these questions, and we are here today to present you the findings of our research. With the two reports that we are discussing today, we contribute to two things. First of all, to unpack the complex landscape of voluntary standards and initiatives operating in carbon management by mapping, categorizing, and benchmarking some of them. We also equip companies on how to best use them to implement carbon management strategies effectively. I am here today with my colleague Erika Luna, Junior Policy Analyst, and Arturo Valderas, Senior Expert on Carbon Management. They are the leading authors of this report that we are presenting and discussing today. They will present the findings and moderate the session with a wonderful lineup of speakers that we have today representing standard setting bodies, private sector actors, and the academy. We will also have engaging moment with you all, so we invite you to stay tuned and to formulate your comments and your questions in the chat, and we will take them through the session. Today is the International Day of Forest, and is the best occasion to talk about this webinar and the thing that we are covering today. Let's honor all the trees that help us to store the carbon that we produce by discussing how voluntary carbon standards can help companies being effective in reducing their carbon emissions aligned with 1.5 degrees scenarios. I would like to pass the word to Erika, who will present the findings of our research and start the conversation with you all. Please, Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for those words and for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Can you see my slides there?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, so for today's presentation, I'm first going to start by giving you an overview of what we did in our two reports, and we're going to navigate the landscape together of this complex landscape of voluntary standards and initiatives for carbon management. I almost dropped my coffee. Sorry. So as I just mentioned, we're going to go over the two reports, our most recent publications. I'm first going to walk you through our report number 1, which we've been referring to as our landscape report, in which we have defined some of the types of these voluntary standards and initiatives. And then I'll walk you through some of the main findings and takeaways. And then as for the second report, we did for this report benchmarking specifically of carbon neutral standards. So I'll just walk you through the methodology, show some results and some of the main findings and takeaways. But before we jump into the presentation, I want to start with a little poll, and Aish, if you can help me launch the poll. So we just want to hear from you in using just 3 words or 1 or 2 to 3 words, just define what voluntary standards and initiatives for carbon management mean. What words do you think about when you read these words? What do you associate with these standards? What type of standards do you think about when you think about standards for carbon management? So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to answer, and yeah, just please feel free to answer the poll. I'm gonna wait until we have at least 15 or so. And Aish, can you help me start sharing the results? Aish, can you share the results?
The results are shared. We can't see them on the screen. Erica, do you want me to read them out?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Ali.
Okay, so we have differences, credibility, difficult, rigorous, credible, access federal funding, scientific greenwashing, unclear, carbon credits, gold standard, Vera, methodology value standard, assurance, complex and complicated, constantly changing, decarbonizing supply chains, agroforestry offsetting, compensating, voluntary carbon market, sustainable consumption and production market pressure, safeguards, emissions, scope measurement, carbon removal, gold standard, and social co-benefits.
Perfect. Thanks, Ali, for sharing. Yeah, I think some of the words that I am hearing is also things mostly related with maybe carbon offsets type of standards, these issues that have been also part of the debate around the transparency and credibility of this type of standards, and also about the complex landscape given the quickly evolving and the quick development of all of these standards. So with all of these words, we're gonna try to make it more, to clarify the landscape and clarify all of these things that we think when we think about voluntary standards and initiatives for carbon management. So this is the first report, and as I mentioned in this report, we did the 4 different types of standards, and we define these 4 different types, but all of these standards at the end of the day have one objective, which is to provide frameworks, metrics to reduce and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and maintain global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And often, most of these standards are developed by either public and private institutions and also non-governmental. And the end users will be companies and different type of organizations, also public and private, but also even individuals. And here on the right, we have a diagram with the typical corporate carbon management cycle that a given company can follow. So usually a company will start their cycle by adopting a climate policy or a climate agenda. And to start addressing the agenda, then one must first measure their emissions to know how much they need to reduce. So this is where the first type of standards come into play, which are those standards that measure carbon footprints and help measure inventories. Then for the third step of the cycle, it will be to start setting mitigation goals and then develop a low carbon strategy, which will need some resources. So the company needs to allocate a budget to develop the strategy. And then once the strategies and the resources are allocated, then they can actually start implementing the mitigation actions. And then this 7th step is really important because they need to measure the impact of these actions and see if they are actually working. And this is also through conducting another emissions inventory to see how much they have been reducing. However, most companies will, and most individuals will still have emissions that cannot be reduced. And these are called residual emissions, for which companies then can turn into this type of standards, which are those that issue carbon offsets to compensate for the residual emissions. Then they will go ahead and communicate their actions and results. And again, this is a very important step because this is also how consumers can learn more about the actions that the company is taking. And this is where the third type of standards, which are those for disclosing climate action and also for just sharing data around climate action, come into play. And finally, we have at the center here of the diagram, the type 4 of standards, which are those that certified for carbon neutrality. And we have put this type of standards at the center of the cycle because this 4th type of standard will usually encompass all the other 3 types. And usually a company needs to go through the whole cycle to get certification for carbon neutrality. In this slide, I have the main findings of this first landscape report. And here the logos represent some of the standards, some of the most widely known standards. I hear in the poll, for instance, someone mentioned gold standard, which is, yeah, probably the most known carbon standard. But even in this categorization that we made, we also provide some recommendations and space for improvement and some opportunities that we believe are important to develop for each of the standards. So for instance, for the type 1 of standards, we believe there's opportunity to harmonize the methodologies used across this standard, so to calculate the emissions inventories, in order to be able to compare apples to apples, in order to compare either the progress of companies at the company level or compare the products, the emissions that different products produced by different companies are emitting. Then, for instance, for the second type of standards, which are the offset standards, we believe here the opportunity is not necessarily on, I mean, we know there's been a lot of also debate around this type of standards. But one of the things that we believe is really important is that companies should first reduce and mitigate their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then they can turn to look into buying and obtaining carbon offsets that are certified with these standards that can also allow for obtaining high quality offsets, which stands for additionality, permanence, they prevent leakage of emissions, and they also do not allow double counting. And for the third type of standards, these are some of the most widely known initiatives, CDP and the Science-Based Targets initiatives, which both can also start pushing for more consistent, transparent, and traceability systems that in the end can prevent greenwashing. This is also very important in how we are addressing the end consumer. And for the fourth type, I'll talk more a little bit about in the second section where we'll dive into the second report. But some of the main takeaways of this first report is, first of all, is that there is definitely a growing and urgent demand for ambitious climate action that goes beyond mandatory requirements. So this type of voluntary standards are an important tool that can provide roadmaps for corporate carbon management and can help companies go towards net zero scenarios. However, as I mentioned, still some challenges. One is about harmonization. Other is about avoiding greenwashing. And because in general, we want that companies are aligned with, in this case, with the graph here on your right, we want companies to be aligned with scenario 4, which are net removals. Because sometimes companies could still, for instance, in scenario 3, be decreasing their emissions, but they are not moving towards net zero scenario. So this is the ideal place where we want to go. Now, just gonna go quickly through the next report, which we are looking deeply into carbon neutral standards. For this report, our objective was to benchmark and analyze the criteria of 9 different voluntary standards and initiatives that certify for carbon neutrality. To benchmark, we based our methodology in CARE, which is our ISD methodology. And CARE stands for Coverage, Assurance, Responsiveness, and Engagement. And for each of these dimensions is made of a set of indicators. And so, for instance, for coverage, the indicators look into the extent to which each standard includes elements to ensure ambitious and effective climate action. For assurance, for instance, the indicators look at the methods and procedures that are used to ensure that the practices and requirements of the standard are actually met. So, for instance, third-party verification. Then responsiveness, the responsiveness indicators look at how the standard's ability to respond to different context-specific conditions like policy development, scientific developments. And then for engagement indicators, these are more about the standard or initiative inclusiveness and transparency and providing access to information. So here is the results of this benchmarking. And here I have tables on the left, the coverage table, and on the right, the assurance table. And I'm not gonna go through all the indicators today, but you can go into the reports and look on the indicators more in detail. I'll just provide you here with an example. So for instance, for the coverage dimension, we have that one of the indicators is about proposing methods required, that a given standard proposes methods to measure the emissions inventory, and that they require that the company includes all scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see here, most of the standards that we benchmark, they do require a specific methodology, and they require that all scopes are included into the inventory. And I'm gonna go to the next one. So for instance, in this table, the responsiveness indicators, here we have performance levels, which means that a given standard provides different performance levels of certification for a company. And what these different performance levels allows is that it shows the progress of a company in achieving carbon neutrality. And it shows whether they are more at an initial stage of their climate journey, or if they're more in a more advanced stage where they, and what we mean by advanced stage is also this ideal scenario where they are reducing more than what they are compensating with carbon offsets. And again, of course, feel free to go into more detail on the tables, on the reports. But here are some of the main findings of our benchmarking. So as you can see here, coverage and assurance, this percentage represent how standards, the amount of indicators that are covered by standards. So coverage and assurance were the ones that were most covered. But responsiveness and engagement had also, responsiveness only had 50% of the indicators covered by all standards, and engagement had only 33%. Some of the recommendations and main findings for standards to also improve in each of these dimensions is, for instance, in the case of coverage, to have a better and clear guidance on the role of offsets. So this is how companies can integrate offsets into their strategy to become carbon neutral. And this is the role of offsets, but also what type of offsets and what type of projects they can be enrolled in. Then as for assurance, of course, we believe there should be third-party verification. Usually standards will require verification for the inventory stage, but we think this verification should be throughout the corporate carbon management cycle. And of course, the importance of keep addressing scope 3 emissions to target entire supply chains. As for responsiveness, we believe there's need to keep updating the standard on scientific and based on scientific and policy developments. This thing that I mentioned about performance levels, integrating performance levels so carbon neutrality can be seen as a process and not as a state. And as for engagement, we think it'll be important to make information publicly available so that also end consumers and the general public can look into the data coming from these companies and specifically the emissions that they are producing or that they are claiming they are producing and the amount that they are reducing and the amount they are compensating. Here's just some of the takeaways from this second report. One and most important is that there's still some weak sectoral governance. So the recommendation here is that there should be an overseeing body that can also regulate in all of these type of carbon neutral standards. There's also a need for consensus around the meeting of carbon and climate neutrality because these two terms are often used like interchangeably, but also different standards define them in a different way. And this consensus is necessary because this will allow us to also be able to compare across different standards, but also for traceability and transparency purposes. The fourth point is about consider dynamic measurements. So this is performance levels that can demonstrate the progress of the company on where they are in their climate action activities. And finally, that all of these tools at the end of the day can be very helpful in being climate action progress monitoring tools. However, for this, it's important that we also strengthen the sectorial governance. So I hope you got a gist of what these two reports are talking about. Again, I welcome you again to look more into them. If you have any questions, also email me with any questions you may have about the reports. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and give the word to our panelists who are gonna also discuss some of the issues that we found throughout the report. So I'm gonna and I'll leave. There'll be time for questions after the panel. So I'm gonna start not my video. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And yeah, so here in the panel, thanks again so much for joining us. We have 4 panelists that will talk about and discuss from their own area of expertise. We have representatives from academia, from these carbon neutral standards that were included in the report, and also from private sector, which we believe it's very important that we have a representative of a company that are already certified as carbon neutral. So for this panel, I have Elena Maro. She's a research associate at the European University Institute, so she's representing academia. For representing standards, we have Dr. Karamanos, who's a senior advisor at the Airport Carbon Accreditation. We have also Austin Whitman, who's CEO at the Change Climate Project. And finally, we have Jamie Richards, which is the director of ESG at Amica and EVA NYC. So I'm gonna start by giving the word to Elena, Elena is an expert specifically on this type 2 of standards in a report, which are those that issue carbon offsets. So my questions for you, Elena, are what challenges in terms of governance do current voluntary standards and initiatives face to complement regulatory frameworks effectively?
So first of all, hi everyone. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the reports, which are very well written and needed in this topic and arena. So to answer your question, I think that the main challenge can be summarized in the words of policy unclarity. So the voluntary standards are really trying to figure out which role they can play in the Paris era, not to hinder the action of the governments over the states. And this means try to navigate a complex and fragmented regulatory landscape where different actors, public and private, are trying to regulate the voluntary carbon market. The problem is further amplified by the fact that there is a lack of an overarching framework. Now, this should have been done by the UNFCCC, but we saw that at COP28 in Dubai, there was not a strong agreement on Article 6, which is the article of the Paris Agreement that should regulate the compliance carbon market at the international level. So what happens is that the voluntary standards are lacking a common denominator, are lacking a vocabulary to able to talk to each other and with the regulatory framework. So there is not a benchmark they can look up to and they can align to. What's more, there is a plethora of initiatives, a plethora of public actors that are running to regulate the market, and they are adopting different rule sets with different criteria that are going to influence in a way or in another these voluntary standards. We're seeing in Europe different initiatives now taking place in terms of regulating reporting requirements and with the aim of fostering transparency, but even in the US, California is doing a lot in trying to regulate the claims. So there is a lot of confusion, a lot of noise, and not a lot of clarity on what is the overall aim. So there is a lot of institutional complexity, and the risk is the one of policy fragmentation. Not to end in a negative message, I think many of these regulatory frameworks are still at their infancy stage. So what this means? It means that there is still an opportunity for them to find their tune and for the different pieces of the puzzle to fall into their place and to create a message that has more sense, and for the voluntary standards to find their place in the bigger picture. I think that for the voluntary standards to complement the regulatory frameworks is necessary for them to have an understanding of the rules of the game. Otherwise, it's a bit difficult to actually complement the frameworks themselves.
Thanks, Elena. I think you already answered a little bit of the second question, but if you can also elaborate on how what are the innovations or advancements that you foresee in the realm of this type of standards?
So I think that going forward, there are different possibility of innovations, and I think that one of the strengths of these voluntary standards, and I think it was one of the words that the audience picked, this continuous capacity of flexibility and adaptation, is an area of innovation and experimentation. That's why the voluntary standards have the capacity really to change fast and stay up to the continuous landscape that is continuously changing. I see, let's say, three main areas of attention for the voluntary standards. The first one is the continuous focus on boosting environmental integrity of credits, and this is crucial, especially for the year that is past us. So for what it was 2024, there was really a turbulent year, full of greenwashing accusations and flow credibility for the voluntary carbon market, that again were words that were picked by the audience. So there is really a need to restore confidence and work on the quality of the credits to be able to deploy solutions at scale. And I think we're going that directions because, again, at COP28, there was an announcement of cooperations among gold standards, Vera, and the recent voluntary standards to strengthen integrity and harmonize rules. So the steps towards the directions are already on the way. The second area of advancement, I think, is increasing interactions with the compliance standards, which possibly open the way for convergence and interactions to be understood in their sensu lato, meaning that they can be really encompassing and comprehensive interactions of mutual influence, from knowledge sharing, from best practice sharing, to really from the production and consumption of credits. We have different ETSs, we have different emission trading schemes already open for the inflow of credits certified by voluntary standards. So we have different degrees of influence from compliance to voluntary standards. And these interactions, in my view, are gonna increase in time. And the third point, I think, is gonna be an increase in zooming, in focusing on carbon removal credits. So this is gonna be crucial in the path towards net zero, and is gonna be a focus specifically on novel or so-called technologically based carbon removal credits that are gonna play a critical role in compensate the residual emissions of the hard-to-abate sectors.
Thanks, Elena. I think, yeah, what you just mentioned and coming from an expert on carbon offsets in particular, I think what you're saying is some of the things that we've also been recently reading, and that it's really important. That also applies to some of these issues of governance, also apply to all the other type of standards that we just talked about. Arturo, I'll let you talk maybe after we hear from one of the standards representative, Dr. Karamanos. Here, Dr. Karamanos, he has been directly involved in the development of the airport carbon accreditation, which has now certified over 250 airports for their activities to reduce emissions. And out of these 255 airports, 39 are certified as carbon neutral. And these airports are all around the world. But also for the airport carbon accreditation, the accreditation does not stop at the neutrality level. In fact, they have 5 to 7 different levels. So this is some of the things that we were discussing during the presentation. So Dr. Karamanos, how can the performance level or these 7 levels of accreditation that the airport carbon accreditation has, how does this approach can help increase engagement of private sector actors?
Thank you very much, Erika, and thank you for having me here in this very interesting panel and for the invitation. I think it's very important to understand, first of all, that airports are very diverse in their nature. We have airports that are very different in terms of size, small, medium size, and large. I mean, you have all traveled through airports of different sizes, very different in terms of location. Just as background information, airport carbon accreditation started in Europe. It was launched in Europe in 2009. And gradually, initially it was planned as a project for Europe, as a voluntary initiative for Europe. And gradually we saw the interest from different regions and became, as of 2014, a global program. So the location is also very important because we have airports that are participating across the globe. We have very different airports in terms of ownership. We have private airports, we have public airports, we have mixed types of airports. We have airports in the US that belong to the local government, to municipalities and counties and so forth. So that's also a very important factor when we're dealing with voluntary programs. as well as we have greenfield and brownfield airports. When we talk about greenfield airports, we're talking about airports that are being developed from scratch, from the beginning in a new location, or brownfield airports that have been there for a very, very long time, and they're being redesigned or reconstructed and so forth. So very, very different types of airports, very different types of companies. And therefore, the program has to be very flexible in order to meet the needs of all these types of let's say, corporate structures. And that's what we did with airport carbon accreditation. That's why we have, as you said, 7 levels of accreditation. Maybe 7 levels are a bit too many, but you need to have some flexibility. So level 1 is the point where an airport comes in and measures its own carbon footprint. Level 2 is you have to do your carbon footprint, but also set a target. Level 3 is where you become carbon neutral. Level 3 plus is where you buy offset reductions and removals and so forth, to the most recent level 5 that we just launched a few months ago, which practically you have to reduce by 90% your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So it's important to be flexible. It's important to be flexible because to implement a step-by-step process for airports, to recognize the the airport efforts, and also to assure that whatever you do is consistent with international standards.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I think that one of the reasons why we wanted to hear from airport carbon accreditation is exactly because of the approach that you're taking, that not all of the other standards that we looked at are also taking. And also it's very specific to airports. I think the lessons can also be applied to other standards. I'm gonna move on into asking to our other standards representative, who's Austin Whitman, and he's the CEO of the Change Climate Project. And at the time that we wrote the report, the standard was called climate neutral. But during this past year, the name of the standard changed, and it's now called the Change Climate Project. So I think this is also an example of how things evolve really quickly, and standards are adapting to changes to scientific and policy developments. But I want to hear from Austin to know more about what has influenced the evolution of standards like the Change Climate Project.
Great. Well, thanks, Erica, and thanks for having me in. Congratulations on the work, which comes at a very important time when folks are really thinking about the future of this space. I was reflecting last night on kind of where the market is and realized that there's a bit of an opportunity to observe, like with the sort of philosophical debate around Schrodinger's cat, that the market is both alive and dead at the same time, depending on where you look. There's carbon and climate neutrality that exists and is thriving, and then there are places where carbon and climate neutrality are fundamentally declared gone. And so it is a really interesting time of transition, and we are right in the middle of it. As you pointed out, we rebranded the organization in October, although I'll clarify that the standard that we offer is still called Climate Neutral Certified. So the organization that operates it does a bunch of different things, and our standard is still Climate Neutral Certified. But what's influenced us, really going back to the beginning, was first up a market need. So we felt that there was a real need for somebody to come out there, particularly in the American market, where there are loads and loads of labels and standards that consumers have gotten used to, but not a single one of them, when we launched, spoke directly to carbon emissions. And that was a real gap. So we wanted to, number one, fill the market need for that. We also saw that there was a lot of demand. So not only was there a gap, but people actually wanted there to be something in that gap, both companies and consumers. And so we felt that the demand was there because climate change is on everybody's minds, and people want to know that they can day to day be making a difference. So there was a market need and a gap. And then there was, I think, thirdly, a realization that a lot of the work that's gone on in the climate movement over the last few decades has really existed in behind closed doors. So has happened kind of within ethereal policy circles or international governance circles, and not a lot of it has really come out and been made more approachable and accessible to individuals who, again, are concerned about what's going on and want to feel like they have some ideas about how they can participate. So we saw at kind of our launch, we saw this opportunity to really start to make these concepts more approachable to people and just make the movement a lot bigger as more and more people think about how to make an impact in their day-to-day, and even are thinking about how to transition their careers into working on climate change. So those are all sort of I would say the market drivers and things that have influenced how we've thought about the standard. And then the sort of fourth and most probably technically important thing is that we've been influenced heavily by the evolution of all these other frameworks in the market. We don't want to be designing and offering a standard in a vacuum. We see that there's evolving science, there's evolving beliefs about what corporate best practices should look like. There are evolving versions of different standards, whether it's from the ISO or the British Standards Institute or any of the other number of organizations that are issuing standards. And we want to be reflective of all of those. And so each of those has had an influence on how we think about what goes into the standard. So it's, as I said, kind of a moment of transition, no doubt. And even looking at the report, I think a number of the frameworks that you all profiled just a few months ago have already changed from what they were at that time, and it'll be interesting to kind of see how this market moves forward. But I love the recommendations and the ideas that you put forth around the need for coordination and governance in this space.
Thanks, Austin. And it's really interesting to hear how you have adapted the standard based on the different evolution. And it's probably also been a lot of work, just doing that. But I think also one thing we want to hear about is related to the challenges that not necessarily the standard, but now the companies that you work with, like your clients, face in addressing Scope 3 emissions. So this is from inventory to mitigation. As I don't know if like some of the people here may know, but some Scope 3 emissions represent often more than 70% of a company's total emissions. And these are often the hardest to address because of data across the supply chain is not very easy to get, essentially. So how do you work with companies in addressing this?
Yeah, it's a great and timely question. We just saw recently the US SEC come out with its financial reporting regulation that omitted Scope 3 and really felt like that was an antiquated approach. At this point in time, everybody needs to be thinking about Scope 3. The way we think about it is that there's sort of a level of successive orbits that every company has. Right? Imagine that you are a company that is represented by planet Earth. All of your suppliers, all of your supply chain is kind of out on successive planets, getting further and further away. And in order to figure out what's going on those planets, you can either use a telescope or you can go visit those planets, right? And so we've found that the first thing that you should do is really just start peering out into space and trying to figure out what's going on. And what you find there is actually going to be meaningful. Eventually, and over time, maybe you'll have the ability to go out and visit every single planet, every single supplier in your universe. But every SME is going to start at a position where that's just not feasible. But we don't think that that's a great excuse for not counting Scope 3 and including it in your inventory. There are very well scientifically adopted and proven methods for estimating emissions within Scope 3, and absolutely every company should be using them, and absolutely they're not that hard. So that I think is something that SMEs really need to be led into understanding, because it is easy to say, nope, too complicated, can't do that. Until we do have all that information down on paper, it will be really hard to develop kind of a widespread understanding of, number one, the point that you raised, which is Scope 3 is a massive chunk of most companies' emissions. And number two, it's fairly easy to understand at least what the big contributors are within your Scope 3 emissions. Now that just gets us to step one of your landscape map, which is the inventory, right? What happens next is really the important stuff. And so we believe that, obviously SMEs are smaller, they have less negotiating leverage, they tend to have less direct control within their supply chain, so that there is a steeper hill to climb for smaller businesses when it comes to figuring out how to tame emissions within the supply chain. So we're starting to see, and even starting to try to enable collaboration among smaller businesses so that they can work together on common problems that they have within their supply chain to basically make up for their lack of leverage by teaming up with their peers to gain leverage and to gain knowledge about what could be done. And that's an opportunity that we see as being particularly exciting. Another thing that we're seeing more and more of is large downstream buyers, whether they're retailers or just large consumer brands. Their supply chain is made up of lots of small companies, and they are, yes, setting standards for their suppliers, but they're also taking more of an advocate role in terms of helping their suppliers do better. And we've seen a lot of great work coming from Walmart in this. They've got 100,000 suppliers, basically one supplier for every 5 of their employees. So it's a massive, massive, massive universe. And we see opportunities with retailers that we work with to actually engage suppliers where the retailer opens the conversation. We can come in with some tools to start to break down these knowledge barriers and eventually get people talking to each other about what the reduction potential looks like.
Thanks, Austin. And I think for this part, I also would like to hear from Dr. Karamanos on, because I believe like the Scope 3 emissions is a challenge from a standard developer's perspective. But what other key challenges are there in creating effective voluntary standards for carbon?
So, I mean, Scope 3 for us as airports, as you can understand, the main source of Scope 3, which in some cases is 80 or 90%, is flights. You're an airport, you have customers are airlines. So for us, you have a flight going from Boston to London. So Boston's airport Scope 3 is actually part of that flight. So it's very big in terms of emissions, and it's also very difficult to manage because there are not many things you can do regarding aircraft emissions. I mean, there are some things you can do, and of course there is a plan as part of ICAO's initiatives and CORSIA and so forth, but still it's not as easy or as manageable as some other sources that you may have for a different type of company. So Scope 3 is a big challenge for airports. But from a standards developer's perspective, again, going back to the early days or 2008, 2009, when we were developing the standard, there was no template, there were no guidelines on how to do these things. So we really didn't know how to do it. Starting from, the name, how should we name this? And I was going back to my records, looking at the names, and I found some really kind of interesting ideas that we had at that time until we reached to the point of calling it airport carbon accreditation, up to the point of defining how many levels, what would each level entail, and so forth. So it's quite difficult to determine what exactly you need in terms of the industry. If it's not industry specific, it may be a little bit more complicated because you have to include all the requirements for all the industries and so forth. So that's one of a key challenge. Of course, another key challenge is what was mentioned by the other co-panelists, that the whole field is evolving. You have the greenhouse gas protocol. You know that right now it's going through a major evolution after so many years. So you have to follow what's going on with the greenhouse gas protocol, with SBTi, with CDP, with any kind of other standard that is developing, and you have to make sure that you are in compliance. And the third point, which for us is very important because we place a lot of importance on offsets. This is also a field that is evolving, especially offset removals. And what we see is that a lot of new companies are coming in with new ideas, with new projects, and we want to make sure that these types of offsets are credible, and so we can guide our airports to buy credible offsets. And that's something that we have to always be on top of things and make sure that the highest quality of the offsets are available for our airports.
Thank you so much for those words, and yeah, it's really interesting to learn about more standards that focus more on a specific sector, but also given that most of the standards are focused on many different sectors and the challenges that also represents. But now we're going to move on into hearing from our private sector representative, Jamie. She represents, she's the director of ESG at Amica and EVA NYC. And the company has been certified it's climate neutral certified by the Change Climate Project, which Austin represents. They have been certified since 2022. And they report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And this company is one of the examples of how scope 3 emissions represents most of their emissions, with around 97% of the total emissions that they report. They have also, but the interesting thing about EVA NYC is that they have also adopted a near-term action plan to reduce their emissions within the next year or two, and they are committed to reduce their 2021 total emissions 50% by 2030. So, Jamie, the questions for you are, how was the development of a corporate climate agenda in your company, and how were standards included in this agenda?
Yeah, thank you for the space. I love talking all things emissions, so any opportunity is exciting to do so. So I actually started the emission program and voluntary carbon standards within our company. It started with actually a B Corp assessment and looking at the different pillars that you can get points for, and one of them being, do you calculate your carbon emissions? And my educational background happens to be in sustainability metrics, and so I did that for the company, and that was really the first step. But it really was not complete. We didn't do the entire supply chain, and we left out of a lot of scope 3, which, as you alluded to, is 90% of our emissions. And I knew that we were missing this data, but I knew that we had the opportunity to get it within our supply chain by just actually looking at our ERP system. And so when actually building out that carbon calculation, I simply just went into our supply chain data and was able to take the physical purchases that we've made and then calculate and compute them into said carbon emissions. The need for a standard really arose because, one, I didn't want to just say we measured our carbon. You know, I work in consumer packaged goods, and if I'm doing this kind of climate work, I need to be able to show something to my consumers and to the rest of the company that then we can then market. And when thinking about what can I claim and realizing that I had enough data to make this climate neutral claim, I thought, well, I really need a third party to verify that this claim is valid. And so we started looking at the markets at different standards, and a lot of them happen to cater to specifically financial companies, and looking a lot of times at monetary emissions, which is not how I set up my emissions report. A majority of my scope 1 to 3 emissions are physical emissions calculations, meaning that we know the weight of the packaging, the distance that the truck went. We don't use monetary estimates except in 3.1 contract spend, and that is it. And so I was looking for a standard that also matched what I was starting to do in the company, which is how I ended up at Change Climate, which has been a really positive experience, and I think a really great entryway for other brands who are looking to make this sort of claim. The other thing I specifically looked for was an organization that had a reduction standard as well, whether it be setting one or hitting a certain target. And so we fell into that boat as well, because once you actually have your carbon measurement, as Austin alluded to before, the most important part is after, right? You can keep working on perfecting your carbon measurement, and we've done so year after year, but what are you going to do after that? Are you just going watch the number go up. No, you need to actually have climate action and set real reduction plans, typically targeting your scope 3 emissions, which is what we have done. And it's been, again, a really positive experience, and building out this kind of voluntary standard within our company has given not just ourselves, but because it's a full company assessment, it's given all of our employees a lot of agency and a lot of stake in the game when it actually comes to climate action, because they know that all of their data and work is going into this type of assessment as well.
Thanks, Jamie. That's really interesting to hear also about how you engage with employees and how this is not only just coming from, I don't know, top-bottom approach, but also giving employees a say in this. And I mean, you already touched a little bit on the challenges, but to gain the actual certification, what were the challenges in reducing your emissions? Like, after you mentioned that it's one thing is measuring your emissions, the second and important thing is actually reducing them, but also how you're also going about this issue of relying on offsets, for instance, for your reduction and compensation.
Yeah, I think honestly the greatest challenge, and always will be, is the breadth of data, and just honestly having a reflecting moment of looking at your data and everything that you've done and saying, okay, when is it progress over perfection, right? When should I stop and actually start looking towards measurement? And to be completely honest, I think I did it a little early. Looking at the following year, I got better data from my contract manufacturers. I had a better understanding of our scope after the first year, and our emissions went up, but it was a better reflection of what we've actually done. And that's absolutely okay. We're still going to maintain our baseline year. We could still lower our emissions to that original measurement, but that can absolutely happen. And so that's been a challenge of now, trying to chase this original number and deciding, like, do we rebaseline to a later year and just set the target higher, or do we just keep going? We're keep going because our reductions are actually hitting now, so we can bring it back to that baseline year. But that's a challenge that companies will hit, right? Is that your number will fluctuate based on different supply chain changes. When looking at specifically carbon offsets to reach reduction, I think it's a really good first step, but I don't know if it's necessarily your end solution. There will always be residual emissions in your supply chain. Even when you hit net zero, there's always going to be residual emissions that you need to take care of. And so having offset partners is a really great way to take care of that. We're turning our heads now to more of offsetting and an inset model, specifically targeting those scope 3 emissions, which is how we're hoping to have true and actual reduction. We took a look at our supply chain, and from now having this data for going on to 3 years, 3 years, we've been able to identify that our hotspots are obviously right within contract manufacturers. And as our businesses have grown, while we don't have a full stake in or large percentage of our contract manufacturers, there are some that we do. And it's within our significant suppliers. And so this year, we've actually been able to offer a renewable energy program to start having some actual reductions and investments within that portion of our supply chain. And that itself reduces our emissions by just 30%, which has now hit my target technically for the next 3 years. So I'm going to be chilling for the next 3 years. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to keep working. But it's those kinds of data and realizations that lead you to have actual change. And so while I will always have a hand in the offset market, I'm really trying to put a larger foot into the inset market.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I think that's a very good example of a company that's actually starting to work on it. And as you just mentioned, I think it's the action part, what's very important. I'm gonna let Arturo here, who's also the leading author of the two reports, to give a summary of this very interesting panel discussion. Arturo.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you to all of you. It's great to see you here. We're very thankful for your participation. I will try to summarize on what the panelists said. I'm trying not to repeat everything, but just the key points. So I will start with the intervention from Elena Marro, who said that there is a plethora of initiatives, voluntary initiatives, and that creates a risk of policy fragmentation. if governance among multiple actors is not enhanced. However, there are opportunities for harmonizations, as many of these efforts are in the infancy stages still. And talking about the opportunities for voluntary carbon markets, in this case, the type 2 of carbon standards, she pointed that there are 3 opportunities. The first, to boost environmental integrity and restore confidence, to increase interaction with the compliance standards and the market, and to address also not only the production but also the consumption of credits, and to pay attention and focus on carbon removal credits for the future for achieving net zero. Then Dr. Karamaros talked about a program under ACA. That they describe that it's a sectoral program, but they are able to reach to different type of users and airports in different places with different sizes. And there are different levels of recognition, basically to recognize the effort of the airports and to give flexibility, which will be very important in these standards. Then Mr. Austin of Change Climate Project, he stated that historically there is a gap in the offer of certified goods, and there is also demand for goods and services addressing the challenges of climate change, and that's why this type of certification schemes for carbon neutrality or climate neutrality emerge. And also because historically climate action happens behind closed doors, not at international level, and it has not been historically accessible to individuals. So these standards are one way to make this more approachable. He also commented on the challenges to address the scope 3 emissions, but however, we acknowledge that it's critical, no? Because there are the methodologies, and it's important to engage with actors related to scope 3, but there are steeper hills to climb for smaller companies. No? One opportunity identified is to work with retailers so they can pull on and help the suppliers to adopt these practices. Then we had again the intervention from Dr. Karamanos to acknowledge that in the transport sector and for airports is a sector with many challenges. It's very difficult to decarbonize scope 3 emissions as they come from flights, from burning fuel. And also stated on the challenges for developing this type of standards, especially from many years ago, when there were no methodologies or guidelines or concepts to address scope 3 emissions or to create the standards themselves. In this context, if there are industry-specific standards, they may be easier to design because they can be built around the needs for the sector, but not for all the industries. And there have been emphasis also in mentioning that these voluntary initiatives have as one of the strengths the capacity to innovate and to change continuously in this context, where he mentioned that GHG protocol is under review. And another thing to consider from the standards perspective is, as there are new certificates, new offsets from carbon removals, it's necessary to ensure its quality, not to also enhance the credibility. And Jamie from the private sector, she told us about the trip, the travel, the journey for the company that started with the preparation of the GHG inventory in a phased approach to finally include all the 3 scopes. Also, they understood there was a need for a standard and to have a third-party verification and validation to review the information and the actions that they were made, and then being able to approach the consumers. They were looking for standards that use also a methodology that was online with what they were doing in detail, not only with rough estimates. And it's important also, one message she said is not only focusing on improving the inventory, but also in going for real reductions. It's very challenging for companies, especially companies that are growing, to reduce effectively emissions as the baseline is changing or increasing. And one advantage of improving the data of the inventory is that it will also help in decision making. And one strategy that they are doing is adopting insetting models to reduce emissions in the supply chain, as offsets may play a role for compensating residual emissions, but not to cover most of the climate action. So that's the key messages I noted down. Sorry if I missed something. And there are also a few comments and questions in the Q&A that we can post to the panelists or discuss here in the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Arturo, for that summary. Yeah, we'll welcome now your questions. I saw that there were some hands raised, but if you can also just put your question on the Q&A chat. There's one here, Anania. She's asking how carbon mitigation deems the fuel coal to replace thermal, wind, and water. What is the next strategic in regards to fund squeezing? I'm not sure I understood the question, but can someone wants to answer to the question? If you can also can everyone open the Q&A box, or is it only me? Probably no one can see it.
We can see it. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Not sure I have much to offer on that question.
There is also
yeah.
another question from Nilam Sari. The question is, right now, the voluntary carbon market usually is to develop market, then can make some issues about moving the carbon. The question regards about how to consider the trade of carbon offsets between different countries, and what type of regulation will be best to regulate these transboundary practices. So probably, I think
Elena.
this resonates to what Elena was saying about the Article 6 of the COP. No, Elena, if you want to address, I don't know if you can read this question in the Q&A section.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's linked more or less to what I was saying. I think considering that trade of credits among countries should fall under the scope of Article 6, which is this article of the Paris Agreement, which is divided into mechanisms. And the Article 6.4 is the successor of the Clean Development Mechanism. There was the mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, which should regulate how different countries should account for the trade of these emission reductions in a way that it avoids double counting. So that's the framework countries should look at in order to know what the rules apply for the trade of units.
Thank you. Yes. There is another questions for you just in the Q&A popped up now from Rasmus Lema. So if you don't mind, I can pose it for you now. The question is, how can offset providers in the Global South best influence the standard setting processes to maximize local benefits? Or to anyone also can.
That's for me.
Yes. If have you seen in the standards in voluntary carbon markets how the providers can influence this?
Yeah, so I think there are different approaches under voluntary standards, but the more we are going forward, and given the Paris Agreement was thought to be bottom up, the more the countries have a say in how these standards should operate in their jurisdictions. So, for example, we see Kenya, that it's a country that in their legislation, they ask for the production of the credits within the borders of Kenya, the 40% of the revenue should go to local communities. So it's important to know that even the countries where these offsets are produced have a say in giving authorization, which is a pillar under the Paris Agreement, to produce these offsets, these credits, and so can put guardrails and can have a say in which are the conditions under which these offsets are produced. And in this way, really guide and decide how to maximize local benefits and in general these co-benefits at the local level.
Thank you, Elena.
I think Dr. Karamanos had this.
Yeah, if I may add a comment here that along those lines in our offset guidance document, where we provide guidance on the types of offsets that airports may want to buy, we have a section which talks about we recommend that airports buy offsets that meet some characteristics, which are some requirements, but also some recommendations about co-benefits. And we recommend that airports buy offsets with co-benefits, which are similar to the ones that Elena mentioned. So that's important. And I think that most offsets, and especially offset removals, include that, including biodiversity protection, employment, and so forth. And it's also important that, when you develop also a good standard, that is also becomes a guideline for others to follow in the future. In our case, it's something that the aviation industry has been following. For example, the green ATM program, or the shipping industry is something that is looking at. So whatever you do quite well, others will follow. So that's quite important to do.
Thank you, Dr. Kramanos. I will now go through the chat. There is first a question from Gayatri Kurana. And the question is, what are your reviews on some countries not signing Paris Agreement and the fact that developed countries are taking sustainable solutions in its favor? And we could elaborate this question also in what will be the implications for voluntary initiatives and offsets, for instance, when countries are not signing the Paris Agreement. What will be the implications in that case? Sorry to going back to you, Elena. Probably you could provide reflection on this. That is in the chat, the comment.
Yeah. So yeah, like how I think the report, the first report that you guys wrote, it was really well written and on able to underline how voluntary standards were conceived in the first place to fill the vacuum left by regulatory where the regulatory action doesn't go, where the regulatory action is not able to reach the voluntary standards come and fill the vacuum there. So I think that especially in this context, in these instances, the voluntary standards have an important role to play. It's always important to remember that these standards should not be a reason to postpone governmental action, because this is always the risk. The voluntary standards have a reason to be, but have a reason to die at a certain point. And hopefully at a certain point will fade away, because it means the regulatory action has have a more encompassing and overreaching action, and all have step up their game. For now, more than happy to have them all, and I think their ambition is more than necessary. Then they should not delay governmental action, in my view.
Thank you. And I will also just elaborate briefly. Also, this question relates to what Rasmus. No, sorry, Neelam,
Arturo, I think we're a little over time.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So sorry. Go ahead then.
Yeah, no worries, but thank you for moderating this last part, and thanks again, everyone, the panelists and the participants. Christina's also gonna close with a few words.
Thanks very much, everybody. It was a great discussion, very, very valuable insights of the 4 panelists and great questions for the audience. Just to close up, I'd like to just three ideas that it came to my attention. The first one is the need for this overarching framework that can regulate carbon markets and the role and the synergies of carbon standards with policy frameworks, I think is critical. The importance of the levels approach, to certify different levels in the carbon management journey that we learned from Dr. Karamanos is a great idea to follow. And 2 inspiring experiences that Austin and Jamie share with us. First of all, is how peers, SME peers, are collaborating in order to measure and account for Scope 3 emissions, and retailers are supporting that. And the smart decision that Jamie left us of insetting the emissions in your value chain through renewable energy or other projects. This is an inspiring example, and hopefully it can be seen across the board in different value chains. So thanks everyone for staying tuned with us, and let's connect in some of the time in this exciting topic of carbon management, given the climate urgency that we are facing. Thanks for all your efforts and for being here today, and congratulate all you both, everybody. Yeah, thanks.